I couldn't listen to my colleagues, Susan Hirsch and Rick Eaton, talking to us about hate speech here in the Holocaust Museum on a day in which we are invited to reflect on the rule of law, without experiencing, as I'm sure you did, the very, very powerful tensions and contradictions in all of those symbols coming together. We have to remember that the Holocaust didn't just happen. People didn't just wake up one morning in Germany and load millions of people into train cars and then exterminate them. The Holocaust was one of the most powerful examples in world history of hate speech leading to hate atrocities. Indeed, it was the use of hate speech, the use of a massive hate-filled propaganda campaign to commandeer the rule of law, to hijack the rule of law, and to render nominally and ostensibly legal and horrific episode of genocide. In fact, I'll go even a little bit farther. I'll ask you this question. Tell me whether you think this is probably true. It seems to me probably true that in virtually every episode of mass hate crime that we have witnessed in the last 100 years across the globe, and even more generally, in virtually every episode of hate crime, such as political assassination of people like Martin Luther King, or the bombings at the Murrah building in Oklahoma City, or 9/11 for that matter, in virtually every instance that comes to mind in which some horrific act of hate-filled, hate-motivated violence has taken place, would you agree with me that the prelude to the violence was hate speech? That you could go back and reverse engineer, and in almost every murder, every assassination, every bombing, every genocide campaign, finding in the antecedent time period hate speech that contributed to it or caused it in some sense. Maybe there's a dissenter in the room. I'm not seeing dissent in your nodding of your heads and your body language. So if we accept that premise, that experience teaches us that very often hate speech leads to hate crime, we're then invited to ask, what then should we do? What does a decent society do? We can make the question even harder, I think, because even in the many instances in which the hate speech doesn't lead traceably to hate violence, most of us will still probably accept the premise, I'll tell you that I accept the premise, that it still causes harm. And both of my colleagues have talked about some of that harm. It can cause individual harm, individual insult to human dignity, to self-esteem, to those who are the victims of the attack, even if they're not physically damaged. It causes groups in society to become estranged and alienated from one another, so it fractionates us and divides us and undermines our notions of society and community and the rule of law. And it damages our discourse, as Susan Hirsch talked about. It makes it impossible for us to engage in the kind of rational discussion and nuanced discussion and give and take and listening and point and counterpoint that one hopes for in a healthy deliberative process. So with all those bad things piled on to hate speech, the hard question that I think we'll be coping with in the next 90 minutes or so as a group, first in individual sessions and then in a larger group, the harder question is, what then should we do? What's the appropriate response? I'm going to share with you my own personal thoughts on my personal responses to hate speech in my own life. And I'll divide that into 3 different arenas and 3 different kinds of responses. The first level of response involves my use of my own expression and my use of societal pressures and cultural pressures, individually and in groups that I'm a part of, to counteract hate speech. The second involves what I will call the fulcrums of affiliation, or the leverage of affiliation. By this second level, what I mean are that I am in a number of organizations. I'm a law school dean, I'm about to become a university president, I'm a member of the state bar, I'm the director in a publicly held corporation, I'm a member of a church. Like most of you, I have many memberships. And so a second type of way to counter hateful discourse and irrational discourse is to use my membership leverage to punish or shun those who purport to be in the group and engage in the kind of destructive speech that we're talking about. And then the third level of response involves my life as a lawyer and involves the question of the extent to which we may use either criminal prosecution. Rick Eaton talked about some of the hate speech mongers that have been criminally prosecuted. To use either criminal prosecution or our tort law, civil liability, or the equivalents, things like the Fair Housing Act, for example, to either financially penalize or incarcerate those who engage in hate speech. Now, I will tell you that as I lay my free speech sensibilities and First Amendment principles upon my behavior in those 3 realms, my toolkit, my ability to respond aggressively to hate speech diminishes as I go through the realms. So I feel the most empowered to attack hate speech aggressively in the expressive and cultural and social realm. I feel the most restrained. I think that existing American legal doctrine puts restraints, not entirely, but to some degree, on my ability to use criminal law and tort law to punish hate speech. And I find in that intermediate realm, in my role as a law school dean, a member of the bar, a member of a corporation, a university president, I find a sort of intermediate level in which I have greater freedom than I have in criminal and civil law to punish hate speech, but perhaps not quite the level of freedom that I have as a free agent myself, simply using my own expression or cultural pressure to bring to bear. And so that's what I want to explore with you, those 3 different arenas in my own life. You have different arenas, and you may come up with different judgments as to what you would do in each of them. And I want to talk to you about some of the trade-offs and conundrums in each of them. In the social and cultural arena, for me, I feel virtually no restraint in the aggressive, vigorous condemnation of hate speech. And indeed, I think that although there may be tactical judgments as to how one is most effective, there's for me no moral ambiguity as to both my right and my duty to rail against hate speech and to use my abilities in print and in other public forums to condemn it when it manifests itself. And even in my leadership roles as a law school dean or as a soon-to-be university president, when an episode of hate speech occurs within the community in which I live, just as we saw the eloquent words that came from the leadership at James Madison recently, I think that it is important for leaders to stand up and be counted and condemn hate speech in that context.